Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show on Science in the Future, we're joined by Dr. Terence Kealey, author of The Economic Laws of Scientific Research and Sex, Science, and Profits, both of which caused some consternation in the halls of academe. Dr. Kealey joins us from the University of Buckingham in the UK, where he was recently Vice-Chancellor and Professor of Clinical Biochemistry. Dr. Kealey, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Kealey, you've become a somewhat passionate advocate of taking a closer look at the public funding of science, and that's why I've had you on the show. But before you get into that, I'd like to look back at history and the evolution of how scientists are viewed by the public. Get us started there.
Well, the most important thing that needs to be said is that the public view of scientists as calm, dispassionate, fair seekers after truth just isn't correct. There's nothing wrong with scientists. I'm not saying that they're dishonest or anything like that.
They're humans.
They're humans, exactly. But the way science has to work is that humans have to, or scientists have to select the data that they're particularly interested in. They have to make assumptions about what is important, what isn't important, and then they go out and prove a theory. Scientists don't just sit there looking at facts because there are too many facts out there.
Mm-hmm.
What scientists do is they develop a theory and then they go out and prove it. And other scientists have other theories. And sometimes scientists clash.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about scientists is in the main, they tend to reject falsification. If someone else says to them, you're wrong, scientists tend to reject that and carry on trying to prove that what they're doing is right.
But I always thought falsification was the key to good science.
Well, that's the fundamental mistake, and thank you for asking. No, what Popper showed is that you can't say that a statement is scientific unless it can be falsified.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists in their daily practice are very unkeen on being falsified over particular facts. And so there's a big difference between being falsified and falsification. Falsification is the area we call science.
Mm-hmm.
However, individual scientists just go to prove a theory and they ignore being disproved because very often they're right to ignore being disproved because at the very frontiers of knowledge, no one is really certain about
Mm-hmm.
anything and you have to ignore inconvenient facts because otherwise you might discard important facts.
To get over the hurdles, although I understand there have been some famous controversies going back through time. You mentioned one between Pythagoras and Hippasus.
Well, that's a very funny one. Pythagoras absolutely believed in perfect numbers. He thought that numbers were almost spiritual, and he thought that numbers were the basis of the symphony of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a student, Hippasus, who discovered that the square root of 2 was not a perfect number. In fact, it's an infinite number. It just goes on and on and on. You
Mm-hmm.
can never get to the square root of 2, just as you can't get the final figure for pi.
Sacrilege.
It's sacrilege. And when he refused to retract this theory, Pythagoras apparently had him drowned.
And I suppose that still goes on today through the process of peer review.
Well, I have to tell you that my old PhD supervisor, now dead, was very much of Pythagoras' mold. He used to hate competitors, and he really used to vibrate with loathing for them. The thing about peer review, it's not really about checking if the paper has been well written and stuff, because you're having to take so much on trust. You never really know what you can and can't take on trust. What peer review is really about is this someone part of the club? Are they a member of a distinguished university? Do they themselves get trained by distinguished scientists? Do they have grants from distinguished grant-giving bodies? It's really about checking that these are people whose word you can trust, because after all, you can't really check what they've done. Peer review is about being part of a club, and of course, therefore, it's very, very dangerous, because peer review means sometimes that really interesting, innovative ideas you will reject because they'll disturb what the club wants to believe.
Particularly if the club controls the funding, and that funding increasingly comes from government, which moves us on to the next issue. Conventional wisdom holds that research is a public good that should be supplied by the government because private enterprise is way too focused on short-term results to invest in research. Have you found this to be correct?
Well, it's a lovely theory. The only problem is it's completely untrue. If you look at the United States of America, for example, which is a really perfect, almost laboratory experimental model here, America's been growing at its GDP per capita at 2% a year since 1820. That's even longer. In a completely straight line from 1820 to the present day. So for nearly 200 years, America's just been growing year on year, once you average it out, at an incredibly steady rate. And that's characteristic of many countries, Britain, Germany, France, all pretty similar. Until 1940, the United States government, federal government, simply didn't fund science, or numbers were so small as to be insignificant and trivial. But after 1940, the American government changed its policy and decided to start funding science very, very generously indeed. And it's now, of course, the world's biggest funder of science. If you look at the underlying rates of economic growth, or what they call total factor productivity, there's simply no deflection to the line. This huge expansion of government funding for science in America has done precisely nothing for economic growth.
Well, couldn't one make the argument that before 1940, they were working on the easy stuff, but after 1940, when all the easy things have been discovered and they have to get to the harder, deeper truths in science, that takes taxpayer money?
Well, the answer to disprove that, there are two bits of evidence that disprove that. First of all, in the 19th century, the French and German governments poured money into their science, and yet there was absolutely no convergence. France and Germany in 1800 were significantly poorer than the United States, and in 1900 there was the same percentage of poverty compared to the United States. So all that government funding for science is absolutely nothing for them then. And I might add that scientists in the 19th century, if you were to tell them that what they were doing was easy, they would be absolutely amazed. What they were doing was very, very difficult, actually coming up with theories such as evolution and really fundamental. I mean, you're telling me that what the Wright brothers did, what Edison did, what Tesla did was easy. At the time, these were seen as giants, huge, great men, Pasteur, because what they were doing was, in fact, incredibly difficult. There's another piece of evidence that one might just mention. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is the club of rich countries, of which, of course, America is a dominant partner, they published a survey recently. It's called Sources of Economic Growth in OECD Countries 2003. It came out in 2003. And they looked at what all the countries of the OECD, all 21 of them, their policies had been between 1970 and 2000. So you've got 21 different countries, all industrialized, over a 30-year period, all engaging in different policies. And by the way, not just the OECD, there's a very distinguished economist down the road from here, American University, called Walter Park. And indeed, I also found the same thing. All three of us have found the same thing. There is no correlation whatsoever between the public funding of research and development and economic growth. But there's a huge correlation between the private funding of R&D, research and development, and economic growth.
Before we get into private funding, I grew up during the space race. At one point during my childhood when we were heading to the moon, I think NASA was eating up almost 5% of the U.S. federal budget. Advocates have always claimed that the economy got a tremendous payoff from this through secondary effects, such as stimulating the semiconductor industry and whatnot. Is there any data that proves that?
There's an awful lot of data that disproves it. The average rich country is spending rather less than 3% of GDP per capita on all the R&D across the entire nation, all industries, all universities, all foundations. So if NASA was spending that much and more, it should have produced an awful lot more than it did. It was hugely wasted money. And indeed, the whole point of NASA was nothing to do with economic growth, and it produced no economic stimulus at all, rather the opposite. It was simply that Kennedy was extremely upset that the Russians had got Sputnik into space first, and he wanted to beat them to the moon.
It was a bragging project. It was a lot of fun while it lasted.
Well, it was great for people like me because I could enjoy watching Apollo 13 and all that sort of stuff in Britain without a penny of my taxpayers' money going to it. But I think if I was American, I mean, you look at the civil rights crises of the day, you look at the way poor people in America, particularly in the South and the inner cities, were being treated. I think if I was an American at the time, I would have thought it was very unfunny. I'd have wanted more money to go to hospitals and schools and less on space, actually.
Well, speaking of that, we're now in our 40th year in the war on cancer. The NIH budget has been something like $30 billion a year for many, many years. Maybe half of that goes to cancer research. Is the government winning the war on cancer?
Well, it didn't win the first battle because you may remember that Nixon launched the war on cancer in 1970 and announced that he would have cured cancer by 1976, in time for the bicentennial. And you may have noticed that's not been the case. So the first battle's been lost. The battle is being very, very, very slowly won. And I have to say, as an adventure in human activity, it's much more noble, I think, and much more impressive and much more important than NASA, because actually it's a relatively small sum of money. And the depth of understanding we're getting into, cloning the genome and all that sort of thing. So I think it is worth it. I think it is being won. It's much more expensive than people planned. It would have happened anyway because an awful lot of science money invariably is duplicated and wasted. And so it is being won. And I wouldn't act very far. Personally, I wouldn't try to stop it or anything like that. But I think it'd be naive to think there's going to be a simple we'll cure cancer in 6 years, which is what Nixon originally thought.
So despite the inefficiency of public financing, we seem to be slowly working our way towards a cure on cancer. What about solving our energy problems?
Well, the government's doing everything it can to damage our solutions to energy problems by this obsession with carbon dioxide and global warming. In fact, our energy problems are being solved by the private sector through the elaboration of fracking.
Dr. Kealey, before the break, you had some comments to make on energy. I'd like to pick that up again and particularly look at private investment in fracking versus public investment in things like Solyndra. Where are we on that?
Well, if you think Solyndra was bad, think about biofuels, where governments all over the world, but particularly in the United States of America, are pouring billions into biofuel projects that are completely wasteful, are producing incredibly little fuel, and on top of everything else, are increasing starvation in the world by raising the price of corn. So those are catastrophic projects. What we should be doing, of course, is encouraging projects such as fracking, and we're seeing the price of oil come down remarkably as a consequence of that, because what we need more than anything else in the world is cheap energy. Cheap energy translates into better lives for people, more jobs, more economic growth, better hospitals, better schools. And the only problem with that theory, the only problem with those anxieties, is the problem that people have over global warming.
So let's get to global warming slowly, but isn't cheap energy, and particularly cheap fossil fuel energy, a threat to alternative energy?
Well, I hope it is a threat to alternative energy, because what we're looking for is not alternative or indeed fossil. What we're looking for is cheap. And if fossil is cheaper than alternative, then let's go with fossil, because the cheapness of energy, it is most important characteristic for the average human being.
Isn't the big argument against fossil fuel the externalities that are caused by pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
Well, the trouble is that we really don't know how much of global warming is anthropogenic or not. We do know that we keep on getting these cycles of ice ages and warm periods. And my belief is that human beings would be much better off with the cheapest energy we can find, which translates, as I said, into better health, and to simply accommodate societies to the rise of temperatures, if they are going to be rises of temperatures, and the rise of CO2, which of course have very positive as well as negative externalities. The rise of CO2 enables crops to grow faster and that sort of thing. We can all move slightly north in our population, so as the world warms up, so the northern and southern hemispheres become more hospitable. There are pluses as well as minuses to gentle changes of temperature in climate, and we shouldn't overestimate our role in climate. Once you consider the sun and all the other factors that control climate, I suspect the human element is relatively modest, and I think we'd be much better off trying to accommodate those changes rather than assume that we can engineer the entire atmosphere.
Well, before going to a solution, let's dive in a little bit into the climate change science itself. There's been a lot of money that's been invested in research. Much of that is public. There's been a lot of peer-reviewed literature and claims of settled science in the climate research area. What is the state of climate science today?
I'm not an expert, so I can only look at the thing globally. But what the climate science debate reminds me of so much is the debate over eugenics in the first half of the 20th century. Between 1900 and 1945, everybody believed in eugenics, which meant that everyone believed that mentally defective people, criminals, and other undesirables should, for example, be compulsorily sterilized. The state of California alone, between 1900 and 1945, sterilized something like 100,000 mentally defective people.
Really?
Yeah, but eugenics was really believed in the United States of America. And it was really believed by intellectuals like H.G. Wells or Bernard Shaw throughout the whole of Europe.
Well, Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, was primarily a eugenicist.
Absolutely. We now know that eugenics led to the horrors and disasters when it was just taken too far in Nazi Germany, and the whole world has now moved hugely back from that. The point about eugenics is there were elements of wisdom there. There were elements there that had value, because basically genetics is important. But the wholesale hysteria over eugenics, which completely captured all intellectual thought between 1900 and 1945, was in retrospect a catastrophic mistake. And that's how I see it with global warming. Of course, there are elements of the global warming debate that aren't entirely silly. But what has happened is being captured by a group of scientists for whom this is a very, very good thing. There are enormous grants to be got here. There's enormous government activism to be achieved here. There are all sorts of vested interests in the global warming debate. And what we have to do as a society is to actually ask much more critical questions than are being asked, in which basically they come down to, in a sense, a form of public choice theory. how much are all these individuals involved in the global warming debate benefiting from it? You've only got to look at the ClimateGate emails from University of East Anglia in Britain to realize that these scientists really are advocates. They have absolutely committed their careers to this idea. Their grants, their status, their professorships, their salaries all depend on this idea. And they are a long, long, long way away from being dispassionate judges of what is really going on.
But isn't the enrichment of climate scientists a small price to pay to protect us from what people are concerned about using the precautionary principle? Suppose they're right, and suppose there is a tipping point that will end in global disaster. Isn't it worth being careful?
Obviously, you don't wish to be gratuitous, but we live in a world today in which not hundreds, not thousands, but literally tens of thousands of people are dying from poverty daily. There are people in Africa, in India, even China still, and the third world, who don't have running water, who don't have access to clean water, who don't have access to electricity, for whom energy still remains something completely out of their reach. I think we have a much greater moral cause to spread cheap energy to raise the standards of living of literally billions of people than to engage in a hypothetical concern. Now, of course, a rational cost-benefit analysis has to be taken. We have to make sure we're not doing anything silly. But on the other hand, the debate is at the moment all led in only one direction. And there are very sensible voices, as my host Pat Michaels here at Cato, for example, but he's by no means the only one, pointing out that the emperor has many fewer clothes than people realize. And if the precautionary principle leads us to produce more expensive fuel in the third world so that people will be dying today, then that's a precautionary principle that has probably gone too far.
Well, if excess population is a burden on the planet, what's wrong with people dying?
Well, that is, of course, a question that takes us into a metaphysical area of the value of human life. But I think you would have to be a very radical thinker indeed to argue that the world would be better off if we go around culling people in Africa. And, of course, you've asked that question with your tongue in your cheek.
Hey, but you know what? It is a serious question, because if you talk to folks who are really concerned about Mother Earth, at the end of the day, they want there to only be 1 or 2 billion people sharing it.
Well, I'll tell you, you're absolutely right. There's a very good book, actually, by Alex Epstein on just this subject called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And he points out that the environmentalists are more concerned about the protection of the environment than the protection of human beings. So the question ultimately is, where do you think your values lie? There is actually, in the long term, a happy route, because rich people have few children. If you look at the countries in this world where they don't replace populations, there's all those with very high GDP per capita. If you look at the countries that are producing children left, right, and center, it's the poor countries. So if you ultimately want a world where there are many fewer people with a high standard of living without having to do anything radical like culling poor people, then the answer is to stimulate economic growth as quickly as you can, because it's rich countries that have fewer children, and populations under those circumstances will then start to fall.
So, Dr. Kealey, how should science inform economic policy?
It shouldn't. Science doesn't need to get involved with economic policy and vice versa. One of the big myths out there is that science is a public good, and if the government didn't fund it, there would not be any economic growth. There's no evidence for that at all. So the only economic policy we need here is an economic policy that allows industry, private industry, to flex its muscles in as deregulated and as free a fashion as possible. There has to be regulation. Of course there has to be. But we should be encouraging private industry to be as entrepreneurial as possible, because it's private industry that will fund the science that will need to create the next generation of new technologies that will give us economic growth.
Is there evidence that private companies will invest in science to make a profit?
There's huge evidence. I mean, just think of it. Just imagine a world in which you have 3 steel companies, 2 of whom invest in R&D and 1 of whom doesn't. Well, which is going to go bust first? Obviously, the steel company that doesn't do research and development is bound to go bust first, because the other 2 companies will develop better steels and grab all the markets. Companies have to do research, and there's very good evidence, in fact, there's overwhelming evidence. The more competitive the marketplace, the more research the companies do. So if you want to do more research as a nation, you free the market as much as possible, you make it as competitive as possible, and that forces companies into investing more and more of their resources into research. The only economic policy you need is laissez-faire.
Well, there's hardly an industry that's done more of its own scientific research in the semiconductor industry. Certainly during its heyday as it was growing, the amount of money Intel was spending on R&D was just profound. But much of that was applied research. Is there a difference between applied research and pure research? For example, like the Hadron Collider in Europe?
No. Well, the Hadron Collider, we'll talk about that in a second, that's not so much pure research, as that's a huge, monumental NASA-type project. But forgetting the Hadron Collider just a second, there is no difference between pure and applied research. I mean, Edison, for example, when he was developing his valves, made a very fundamental discovery in the nature of the thermionic effect. And there are thousands of such examples. And in fact, you can show in private industry that there's a direct correlation between the amount of money that companies spend on pure science, which is pure science, not applied science, and subsequently rates of company profits, because actually pure science is an extremely profitable activity for companies, because if they employ pure scientists to do pure science, they end up employing the very best people there are around the place to learn how to copy and bring into the company the best of the science that's going on out there. So it's a very good investment, pure science.
Dr. Kealey, what changes do we need to make in science education? So many of our PhD scientists are really trained to become principal investigators and academic scientists, and of course there's only so much room for them. And the ones who go off to industry are often viewed by their professors as failures. This goes counter to what you just described as a better strategy of investing in industry research. How can we fix this?
Well, you fix it by stopping the government funding the science. I mean, the government has created a completely false little eco-environment in all these top research universities. All the money that's going into the salaries of these professors in these prestigious universities is coming from the taxpayer. It's a completely artificial market. In the olden days, and you've only got to go back 40, 50 years in America to see that, industrial scientists were paid markedly more than university scientists, although they weren't badly paid themselves as it happened. And what you had was a very real need in industry for good scientists, and they paid for it and they got it. What's happening at the moment is a distortion of the market, and all the good scientists are quite right by going into the universities, because frankly, it's just more fun. If you go into university science, you're given much more freedom to do what you want than if you're an industrial scientist. But the world should not be organized that way. We should not be taking taxpayers' money so that scientists can have fun in universities. We should be leaving that money in the pocket of the taxpayer so that scientists, like everyone else, have to meet the needs of society primarily in industrial labs. So the solution to the question that you've asked is for the government to stop pouring money into this artificial ecology of the university science community.
Well, Dr. Kealey, it's been a pleasure having you on your show, and it's so unusual to hear an academic like yourself sharing these views. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Terence Kealey, former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham and author of Sex, Science, and Profits, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests, please visit realclearradio.org, click on the email Bill link, and drop me a line. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show on science, science fiction, and government. Please welcome 1330 WEBY Pensacola, Florida to our growing lineup, and come back to join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.